So, the absolute most breathtaking, profoundly devastating, and historically unprecedented constitutional earthquake in the entire modern history of the British royal family has just been violently, shockingly exposed to the entire world. And the absolute most terrifying part isn't that a massive, highly classified secret was somehow leaked by a shadowy, anonymous palace insider, but rather that Sophie, the Duchess of Edinburgh, completely, explicitly, and undeniably broke her famously ironclad, decades-long silence to personally, publicly reveal a massive, highly manipulative, and deeply toxic ultimatum that King Charles deliberately, aggressively attempted to forcefully lock into place entirely before Prince William's massively anticipated coronation could even be officially scheduled on the royal calendar. If you have been obsessively, intensely watching the incredibly fragile, highly volatile power dynamics violently simmering just beneath the incredibly polished, completely fake surface of the unimaginably wealthy Windsor dynasty, and wondering exactly how far a deeply terrified, highly controlling monarch would actually, truly go to ruthlessly manipulate his own son's future reign, you absolutely need to buckle up, lock in, and pay incredibly close, undivided attention to every single, devastating detail of this breakdown, and you absolutely must hit that subscribe button for Monarch Access right now, as we mercilessly, completely, and aggressively pull back the heavy, gold-trimmed velvet curtain on the absolute most explosive, psychologically terrifying, and masterfully executed display of raw, unchecked, incredibly ruthless sovereign power ever witnessed in our entire lifetime. You have to completely, systematically, and ruthlessly deconstruct absolutely everything you think you know about the supposedly peaceful, highly dignified transition of power between Charles and William, because we are absolutely, fundamentally not talking about a simple, petty, standard palace disagreement over incredibly trivial things like the official guest list, the specific musical arrangements, or exactly who physically gets to stand where on the famous, highly photographed Buckingham Palace balcony. We are talking about a highly classified, legally binding, aggressively drafted, and incredibly dangerous written demand explicitly, undeniably insisting that Prince William absolutely had to sign a formal, unbreakable constitutional document personally guaranteeing Sophie a permanent, unshakable, legally protected seat on the absolute highest, most elite level of the sovereign's inner council, and if the fiercely independent Prince of Wales actively refused to submit to this massive, unprecedented power play, King Charles would ensure the entire, multi-billion-dollar global coronation timetable would simply, immediately, and aggressively stall into absolute terrifying oblivion. And Sophie's incredibly explosive, highly damaging, and totally undeniable admission absolutely didn't come sneaking out through some vague, leaky, highly sanitized palace press release, or a whispered, cowardly, anonymous source heavily bribed by a friendly tabloid journalist. It happened directly, explicitly, and shockingly at a highly restricted, incredibly private, heavily attended royal reception at St. James's Palace, where her incredibly raw, deeply emotional, and totally unfiltered words were perfectly documented, fully confirmed, and emotionally heavy enough that she openly, shockingly admitted to the entirely stunned room that she felt absolute suffocating, paralyzing dread, completely devoid of any relief, gratitude, or pride. The exact, terrifying millisecond she initially, fully learned exactly what King Charles had aggressively, secretly done, behind closed doors to manipulate the future of the crown. Because, honestly, you have to truly deeply imagine for a single, agonizing second being explicitly, privately told by the absolute highest authority in the land that you are so incredibly valued, so absolutely, undeniably crucial to the fragile family's ultimate survival, that the currently reigning King of England is completely, totally willing to deliberately, legally, and internationally delay his own flesh and blood's sacred, thousand-year-old crowning ceremony just to explicitly, aggressively protect you and your future influence. But that incredibly aggressive, heavy-handed, utterly terrifying protection instantly, violently, and permanently makes you the exact, highly toxic, heavily resented reason the furious father and the deeply betrayed son are now intensely staring at each other across a massively widening, incredibly dangerous, entirely unbridgeable generational gap. That is exactly, precisely where this entire, incredibly complex, deeply painful story lives. In that incredibly dark, deeply uncomfortable, highly agonizing space, exactly between being genuinely, beautifully honored for decades of flawless, incredibly loyal service to the crown, and being brutally, manipulatively, and cynically used as a massive, world-stopping constitutional test of a future king's ultimate, humiliating submission to a dying monarch's absolute control. The absolute, unyielding, entirely unbreakable core of this entire massive, world-shifting dispute is a highly classified, totally unprecedented piece of royal legislation, officially, internally called the Coronation Continuity Accord, which was the highly formal, official, terrifying name of the specific, legally styled document that Charles personally, aggressively, and meticulously drafted in absolute secrecy alongside his most fiercely loyal, heavily compromised senior constitutional lawyers, and incredibly, shockingly, it already fully bore his own massive, highly authoritative royal signature right at the very bottom of the heavy parchment, leaving William's designated, highly visible line entirely, glaringly, and aggressively blank, waiting for his total submission. This terrifying accord absolutely wasn't just a friendly, gentle, paternal suggestion, or a casual, entirely verbal, completely unenforceable understanding between two powerful family members having a quiet drink. It was a highly formal, incredibly dense, legally binding agreement that directly, explicitly, and undeniably linked the entire, massive, highly complex global progression of the upcoming coronation schedule to Sophie's legally guaranteed, absolutely permanent role on the highly restricted Inner Council, which is that incredibly small, highly elite, entirely untouchable circle of senior royal advisors who possess direct, completely unfiltered, totally absolute access to the monarch's ear during severe, apocalyptic national emergencies, or massive, highly sensitive, incredibly destructive family crises. Charles's specific, deeply paranoid logic, according to Sophie's own incredibly tense, entirely raw public recollection, was his absolute, unyielding, deeply terrified belief that total, unbreakable institutional continuity explicitly required having someone intimately, completely close who was entirely, fearlessly willing to speak the absolute, brutal, highly uncomfortable truth directly to the sovereign when diplomatic, cowardly silence felt vastly safer to everyone else in the room, and he firmly, absolutely, and undeniably believed she was exactly, perfectly that single, indispensable person required to keep William's highly impulsive future reign from completely, disastrously derailing. The massive, entirely undeniable, completely catastrophic problem is that by aggressively, unilaterally, making it a completely non-negotiable, pre-coronation, absolute condition, King Charles instantly, forcefully, and cruelly put Sophie in an incredibly toxic, entirely impossible position where absolutely every single professional, societal, and constitutional advantage the massive document legally gave her instantly, undeniably made her look exactly like she was actively, aggressively, and selfishly standing directly between William and his rightful, historically ordained succession to the ultimate, ancient crown. She explicitly, clearly, and heavily stated herself that she absolutely never, ever, not for a single fleeting second, asked Charles to aggressively, secretly, impose this specific, highly controversial mandate. She absolutely hadn't quietly, politically campaigned behind the scenes for a permanent, highly coveted council seat, or demanded absolutely any kind of massive, historical, highly public reward for her decades of quiet, completely selfless devotion. But once that formal, highly contentious, entirely weaponized condition officially, legally existed on paper, her entire, highly respected royal future wasn't actually about her loyal, beautiful service to the British people anymore. It was instantly, violently transformed into a massive, highly dangerous, incredibly explosive bargaining chip, actively, cruelly weaponized between a deeply sick, highly paranoid father who deeply, truly feared his fiercely independent son would aggressively, ruthlessly, and totally erase absolutely all the accumulated, hard-won experience from the previous, highly successful reign, and a proud, incredibly strong, highly determined son who deeply, profoundly feared his absolute first, highly defining act as the new supreme king would be publicly, humiliatingly, obeying a strict, unyielding, deeply controlling command, written entirely by someone else from the grave. So that is exactly where the entire highly charged dynamic gets incredibly, deeply weird, and completely, totally fascinating, because Prince William's immediate, visceral, entirely genuine reaction absolutely wasn't an explosive, highly public, screaming fit of furious, uncontrollable rage that the tabloids would have absolutely loved to frantically report on. When the Prince of Wales was first handed the incredibly thick, highly classified, heavily guarded briefing folder containing the Accord, and completely understood exactly what his father was aggressively, manipulatively demanding of him, he simply, quietly, and incredibly coldly closed the heavy leather cover entirely, before even reaching the final, signed page, while Princess Catherine stood completely silently nearby, intensely watching him intentionally, completely, and coldly withdraw deeply into himself, rather than loudly, dramatically, and uselessly erupt into shouting. Sophie later intimately, completely understood, with absolutely profound, deeply heartbreaking clarity, that William absolutely wasn't aggressively angry that she had spoken up in the past, or that she possessed strong, necessary opinions. He was deeply, profoundly, and completely wounded to his absolute core that Charles actually, genuinely believed he explicitly, fundamentally needed to be legally, forcefully, and entirely cornered into honoring her years of service, heavily implying that his father thought he was totally devoid of basic honor, true respect, and functional loyalty. That specific, incredibly emotional, totally profound distinction matters immensely to understanding the absolute true depth of this massive crisis. If William had simply been acting as a stubborn, power-hungry, incredibly arrogant, and entirely selfish heir, desperately grasping for absolute control, this would be a much simpler, incredibly boring, completely standard story of royal greed, but he was genuinely, deeply, and intensely hurt by the total lack of basic, fundamental trust. He truly, actively, and completely respected Sophie and everything she had sacrificed for the institution, but he just fundamentally, absolutely believed with every fiber of his being that his very first, highly defining, utterly historic act as the supreme, unchecked sovereign simply had to demonstrably, undeniably, and entirely publicly prove his absolute, complete independence from his father's deeply flawed, highly manipulated court, and actively, publicly signing a highly restrictive, legally binding document that arrived with his father's commanding, heavy signature already aggressively in place, felt significantly less like protecting vital continuity, and vastly, entirely more like being forcefully, brutally forced to begin his entire, highly anticipated reign, completely trapped beneath another man's lingering, heavy, deeply controlling shadow. Meanwhile, deep inside the ancient, heavily fortified walls of the palace, King Charles was reportedly sitting completely alone in his deeply quiet, heavily shadowed private study, literally, physically spreading Sophie's incredibly detailed, years-long engagement records, massive charity reports, and highly private correspondence entirely across his massive, antique mahogany desk, actively, physically circling specific, highly tense, incredibly crucial historical moments where she had quietly, brilliantly, and entirely seamlessly prevented massive, deeply damaging family tensions from exploding into highly public, completely irreversible, utterly destructive media crises. He explicitly, heavily, told a highly trusted, deeply loyal senior constitutional aide that while William completely, flawlessly understood the rigid, ancient structure of duty, the necessity of public service, and absolute constitutional limits, the younger, highly ambitious prince might severely, dangerously, and completely underestimate the massive, long-term, entirely devastating emotional cost of aggressively, completely removing the exact, specific people who truly, deeply knew how to speak honestly and fearlessly when absolutely everyone else in the incredibly intimidating room simply stayed terrified, obsequious, and completely silent. So, both incredibly powerful, highly determined men possessed entirely valid, deeply held, utterly profound fears regarding the survival of the thousand-year-old institution. But the massive, entirely unavoidable, deeply heartbreaking tragedy is that those deeply personal, highly valid fears became completely, structurally, and entirely incompatible the exact, precise, devastating moment they were formalized, aggressively weaponized, and legally drafted into a binding, entirely unyielding constitutional document. But the actual, deeply complicated, highly fascinating timeline of this entire massive, world-shifting conflict actually starts exactly several tense, highly publicized months before the highly controversial coronation condition was ever formally drafted, beginning during a highly tense, deeply scrutinized, incredibly important Commonwealth service planning meeting held deep inside the heavily guarded, completely secure walls of Buckingham Palace. The massive Commonwealth service is that incredibly important, highly symbolic, visually spectacular annual ceremony, specifically honoring the various, widely diverse nations, deeply connected through the vast Commonwealth, and absolutely every single physical position, minute seating arrangement, and explicit mention in its highly choreographed, massive procession, carries immense, undeniable, totally global symbolic weight. Sophie suddenly, sharply, and incredibly astutely noticed that several incredibly loyal, long-serving, highly respected Commonwealth representatives, people whom the late, beloved Queen Elizabeth II had personally, explicitly, and highly publicly promised would be formally, officially recognized at the absolute next major, historic service, had been quietly, aggressively, and entirely removed from the official, freshly printed order of service. Their highly important names were just completely, inexplicably, and disrespectfully gone. William had officially, directly approved a significantly shorter, highly streamlined, deeply condensed procession specifically to radically modernize the incredibly lengthy event and actively prevent long, boring broadcast delays, which he genuinely, firmly, and completely saw as a highly practical, entirely necessary administrative, modernizing decision, absolutely not a cruel, vindictive, or deeply personal slight against his late grandmother's trusted allies. Sophie, however, possessing an incredibly deep, deeply ingrained, and totally flawless understanding of absolute royal honor, saw it completely, radically differently. She firmly, aggressively placed the newly revised, heavily edited, totally unacceptable order of service directly in front of Charles, physically pointed to the glaring, incredibly disrespectful empty spaces on the crisp white paper, and explicitly, directly, and fearlessly asked whether raw, cold administrative efficiency now suddenly mattered vastly more than a beloved, historically flawless sovereign's sacred, absolutely unbreakable word. The king slowly, incredibly carefully read the specific page once, then intensely, deeply read it again in total, suffocating silence, while William was standing right there in the incredibly tense, entirely freezing room, already deeply sensing that this incredibly sharp, highly pointed, fearless question was explicitly, aggressively aimed at, vastly, profoundly more than just the simple, trivial ceremony schedule. He quickly, firmly, and slightly defensively told Sophie that incredibly massive, sweeping coronation-era decisions and highly complex modern protocols simply couldn't be constantly, endlessly reopened every single time they carried a tiny bit of emotional, deeply nostalgic history. She instantly, coldly, and incredibly bravely answered without a single second of hesitation that exact, specific, deeply resonant history was exactly, perfectly, what gave those massive, highly scrutinized royal decisions their true, undeniable, absolute meaning. And then she aggressively, surprisingly, and totally shockingly removed her own highly prominent, highly coveted name from the prestigious, globally televised procession list entirely, and explicitly, proudly offered her highly coveted place to one of the unfairly excluded representatives, explicitly stating to the entire stunned room that she absolutely would not accept a massive public honor from a ceremony, fundamentally, entirely built directly on a broken, forgotten, deeply disrespectful promise. Charles silently, carefully waited until an incredibly frustrated, deeply annoyed William finally left the incredibly tense, suffocating room, and then the king slowly, deliberately opened a highly secure, deeply hidden private desk drawer. Inside was a fragile, incredibly sacred handwritten note directly from the late Queen Elizabeth II, completely, explicitly confirming exactly what Sophie had perfectly, flawlessly remembered, that those specific, loyal representatives were absolutely, unquestionably supposed to be formally, publicly recognized. The incredibly arrogant, highly modernized, totally unfeeling palace machinery had casually, ruthlessly allowed that incredibly sacred promise to simply disappear into the void, and Sophie was the absolute, only person in the entire, massive institution who would completely, stubbornly, and fiercely refuse to let it go. That exact, specific evening, an incredibly moved, deeply impressed Charles explicitly instructed his senior private secretary to immediately, completely begin drafting a massive, highly protective, legally unassailable mandate for her future, permanent role, firmly deciding that he was absolutely not going to let her incredibly rare, deeply necessary honesty become the exact, specific reason she was aggressively removed from the highly restricted decision-making circle when William eventually took power. But William inevitably later discovered exactly where and why the highly controversial condition had originally begun, and when he finally, aggressively entered the room, carrying the entirely unsigned, highly contentious accord months later, the massive, boiling, utterly explosive argument was absolutely no longer about one single, simple, trivial ceremony. It was entirely, fundamentally, about whether Sophie had actively, aggressively helped Charles, explicitly, deeply, question his own son's ultimate, fundamental fitness to rule the entire nation. That is the exact, explosive, totally catastrophic moment the entire conflict completely stopped being about a simple, bureaucratic council seat and became entirely, violently, and irrevocably about absolute, unbreakable trust at the most fundamental, deeply personal, and highly constitutional level. Now, here is exactly where Princess Catherine suddenly, incredibly importantly, enters the incredibly messy, totally chaotic story in a completely unexpected, deeply shocking way that instantly, utterly complicates absolutely everything. William absolutely didn't coldly, cowardly summon Sophie through a junior terrified aide when he intensely wanted to confront her about the massive constitutional crisis. He personally, physically, carried the heavy, deeply consequential unsigned accord directly to her himself, with absolutely no private secretaries, no nervous courtiers, and no security details. Just the two of them, entirely alone, in a small, incredibly quiet, entirely isolated sitting room at Windsor Castle, with the heavy oak door firmly, completely closed by his own hand. He firmly, aggressively placed the highly controversial document directly on the antique table, and explicitly, pointedly asked the exact, highly uncomfortable, incredibly direct question Sophie had deeply, entirely feared from the very beginning. Had she actively, willingly allowed Charles to completely weaponize her incredible loyalty into a massive, highly manipulative, entirely uncalled for test of his own son's true, unyielding readiness for the heavy crown? She absolutely didn't retreat, she didn't cower, and she didn't attempt to spin the narrative. She openly, honestly, and fearlessly admitted that Charles had indeed discussed actively protecting her future access to the inner workings of the palace. But she firmly, sincerely, and utterly swore she had absolutely never known he fully intended to connect that aggressive protection directly to the actual, highly sacred coronation ceremony itself. She looked William directly in his blazing eyes and firmly, absolutely told him she would never, ever have accepted any highly elevated role that forcefully, publicly, and humiliatingly made him choose between his sick father's unyielding, aggressive command and his own absolute, undeniable, completely necessary sovereign authority. Then, she slowly reached completely across the table, took the heavy, legally binding document, and explicitly, physically pointed to one highly specific, incredibly chilling sentence written directly by Charles himself. Continuity requires someone willing to speak when affection makes silence easier. That absolutely wasn't a gentle, loving, entirely paternal message. It was a massive, incredibly blunt, highly aggressive, completely undeniable warning to the future king, and Sophie instantly, bravely followed it with the exact, incredibly difficult question William had been desperately, heavily hoping to completely avoid. She directly asked whether he had truly, honestly, ever intended to preserve her highly respected place at the table, or whether he had actively, secretly, and ruthlessly planned to completely, violently remove Charles's entire inner circle as soon as the absolute accession was perfectly complete. William finally, heavily, and incredibly reluctantly admitted the completely undeniable, highly classified truth. His incredibly early, highly secret, deeply restricted restructuring proposal would have entirely, completely dissolved the existing, heavily entrenched, deeply influential family council and aggressively, ruthlessly replaced it with a significantly smaller, highly streamlined, incredibly modern group built entirely, exclusively around himself, Catherine, and a group of highly professional, entirely unfeeling, strictly constitutional staff. Sophie instantly, completely understood the massive, incredibly terrifying implication of this massive revelation. Charles had clearly, undeniably seen that highly secret, deeply classified proposal entirely before writing the aggressive condition, meaning absolutely someone deeply embedded inside William's own highly trusted, entirely secure inner circle, had deliberately, secretly, and entirely illegally placed it directly into the king's hands. That highly trusted, incredibly secure someone was Catherine. She had secretly, quietly found Sophie's name entirely, glaringly, and shockingly missing from the massive, totally redesigned future advisory structure, and deeply, truly, and absolutely believed William was moving incredibly, dangerously, and far too quickly to entirely, aggressively separate his new, unproven reign from his father's highly established, deeply experienced household. She deeply, truly feared he would drastically, terribly mistake cold, brutal distance for absolute strength, and deeply, horribly regret entirely losing the absolute one person who was entirely, fearlessly willing to constantly challenge him without desperately, greedily seeking a massive personal reward. So, she explicitly, secretly, and completely unilaterally transferred the highly classified, deeply sensitive proposal directly to Charles herself, and later tearfully, heavily, and incredibly bravely admitted it to Sophie while sitting directly beside William's completely unopened, highly controversial coronation box. Her hands stayed tightly folded in her lap, but her voice completely, noticeably broke as she desperately, emotionally explained that successfully protecting her husband's incredibly important, entirely fragile future reign had tragically, horribly, and unavoidably required actively, secretly betraying his absolute, deep confidence. Sophie physically, intensely, felt the incredibly deep, totally unexpected wound, immediately, explicitly, firmly stating she had absolutely never, ever asked Catherine to actively, secretly, intervene for her in any capacity, and she heavily, intensely warned the Princess of Wales that massive, aggressive protection built entirely through hidden, deeply secret, highly manipulative decisions could incredibly easily become massive, toxic manipulation, even when the underlying fundamental intention was pure, unadulterated, entirely selfless love. Catherine quietly, heavily, and completely accepted the incredibly sharp, entirely justified rebuke, but she also deeply, truly, and undeniably knew that absolute, cowardly silence would have entirely allowed William to ruthlessly, blindly cut away years of incredible, highly necessary experience he might very soon desperately, incredibly deeply need to simply survive the crushing weight of the absolute crown. When an incredibly shocked, deeply betrayed William finally learned the full, devastating, utterly unvarnished truth, he quietly asked Catherine whether she genuinely, truly believed he was completely, utterly incapable of properly, intelligently choosing his own senior advisors. He absolutely didn't shout, which made the incredibly quiet, intensely loaded question vastly, entirely more painful, and completely devastating. She softly, firmly, and incredibly bravely answered that she deeply believed he was absolutely capable, but she also truly, intimately knew he was incredibly angry, massively rushed, and intensely, aggressively determined to blindly prove his absolute, unchecked independence, completely, before anyone had actually, truly challenged whether that independence was truly at risk. That is an incredibly devastatingly accurate, entirely brilliant, completely undeniable read of the highly tense, wildly explosive situation, and it perfectly, flawlessly explains exactly why this massive, deeply complex, entirely unprecedented conflict absolutely couldn't be resolved by simply, easily signing or violently refusing to sign a piece of heavy parchment. The document had entirely, undeniably become a massive, incredibly heavy, completely unavoidable symbol of something vastly larger, whether William's highly anticipated, totally scrutinized reign would ultimately begin as completely his own, or simply as a heavily controlled, highly anxious, totally manipulated extension of his father's deepest, darkest fears. The highly practical, entirely devastating, completely massive consequences started rapidly, aggressively piling up incredibly fast, because a massive, globally televised coronation absolutely, fundamentally depends on absolute, unyielding, entirely flawless certainty. Absolutely every single carriage movement, ancient oath, specific signature, military formation, and highly choreographed global broadcast cue has to be completely, unchangeably fixed long before the massive, priceless crown is ever physically lifted onto his head. But William's heavily unsigned promise actively, terrifyingly created a massive, entirely deafening silence, exactly at the absolute center of all the frantic, massive, highly expensive preparations. The incredibly complex, massive rehearsals, relentlessly, stubbornly continued, yet the final, absolutely necessary royal approval did entirely not come. The incredibly stressed, totally panicked, deeply exhausted staff entirely stopped asking whether the actual, specific timetable had simply changed, and quickly, terrifyingly began asking whether the entire, highly protected royal family itself had totally, permanently fractured before the new reign had even officially, publicly begun. Charles stubbornly, aggressively, and entirely unapologetically withheld the absolute sovereign's approval memorandum, which is the exact, specific monarch's highly formal, legally binding written permission, completely allowing the absolute last stage of massive, global planning to finally proceed. Without it, highly stressed officials could continually, endlessly prepare, but they couldn't officially confirm absolutely anything. Highly important foreign guests, massive, heavily armed military units, global broadcasters, and deeply exhausted palace staff, absolutely all of them deeply, entirely depended on exactly one specific, unchangeable fixed date, and that date simply, infuriatingly, couldn't be formally, officially announced. Senior, highly ranked officials were strictly, quietly told to frantically continue massive, incredibly expensive rehearsals, while actively, entirely avoiding absolutely any kind of official public confirmation, which left them completely, suffocatingly trapped directly between incredible, massive urgency and totally deafening, absolute silence, with every single delayed answer rapidly feeding massive suspicion, and every heavily closed meeting making the incredibly deep division feel vastly more serious and highly destructive to the entire sovereign institution. Sophie quietly, tensely arrived for a highly scheduled briefing entirely during this massive, exhausting chaos, and immediately saw her own specific name physically printed directly beside the incredibly controversial new council position. She instantly, aggressively crossed it out heavily with a pen right in front of the highly stressed secretary, and loudly, firmly declared that absolutely no rehearsal should ever carelessly treat the incredibly toxic condition as officially accepted completely, before William had truly, entirely chosen freely. Edward reacted with immense, deeply visible frustration, aggressively telling her that actively, publicly withdrawing now would only heavily reward the incredibly arrogant, heavily entrenched courtiers who viewed deeply dependable, highly loyal service as entirely, incredibly disposable. She quietly, firmly answered that remaining totally, cowardly silent would inevitably, absolutely make William deeply, truly believe she valued the incredibly powerful, highly coveted seat, significantly more than his absolute, unbreakable trust. That is exactly the incredibly loyal, highly principled Sophie that Charles had been desperately, aggressively trying to protect. The exact one who would completely, instantly, rather entirely, lose the highly powerful position than have it permanently, totally become a massive, highly toxic source of incredibly deep family division. But Edward absolutely wasn't entirely wrong either. Completely, utterly surrendering could easily, ruthlessly erase decades of absolute, incredible loyalty in exactly one single, highly impulsive decision. The incredibly panicked, totally overwhelmed Coronation Council, the massive, highly elite group entirely responsible for directly coordinating the massive ceremony, eventually, desperately demanded an absolute, completely final timetable, strictly within 48 highly stressful hours. Without it, entirely massive international delegations and huge military units would be formally, embarrassingly told that the massive preparations were under review, which is incredibly polite, terrifying diplomatic language for something is incredibly, horribly wrong. William intensely, aggressively ordered his highly stressed office to immediately, quietly prepare exactly two completely different, totally massive announcements, one explicitly, happily confirming the coronation, and the entirely other, deeply, embarrassingly explaining its massive postponement directly because of entirely unresolved, highly sensitive transition arrangements. Before either incredibly massive, potentially world-shaking statement could possibly be released, Sophie quietly, intensely asked to meet him completely alone. She absolutely wasn't coming to aggressively, selfishly force his highly reluctant signature, but she was quietly, brilliantly, coming with an incredible, entirely unexpected solution Charles had absolutely never, ever even imagined. Sophie deliberately, incredibly carefully, chose the incredibly private, highly secluded chapel at Windsor for this massive, incredibly important meeting. A very small, deeply quiet place of absolutely intense worship, strictly reserved exclusively for the royal household, completely far from all public ritual and massive formal business, with absolutely no heavy wooden desks, no massive files, and no highly classified briefing papers anywhere in sight. She quietly, intensely handed William a fully signed, completely legally binding personal declaration, explicitly, permanently renouncing absolutely any right she might ever have to aggressively enforce the highly controversial council guarantee, completely after the actual coronation was completed. In incredibly simple, totally undeniable terms, she was explicitly, fully giving him the absolute, unyielding power to completely remove her entirely without any challenge. She looked directly at him and intensely, quietly told him she would absolutely rather lose every single future, highly coveted role than forcefully, aggressively enter his new, incredibly important reign as the living, walking symbol of Charles's aggressive, absolute control. William deeply, truly heard the incredible, immense pain, perfectly hiding beneath her incredibly steady voice, and finally, totally understood that Sophie had absolutely never, ever wanted highly controversial, deeply resented authority, aggressively protected by pure force. His intense, completely blinding anger at Charles had incredibly tragically made him explicitly, unfairly treat her entirely as part of the toxic, highly manipulative condition, instead of the deeply loyal, entirely innocent person, completely trapped inside it. He quietly, entirely admitted he had incredibly unfairly judged her entirely, before simply asking what the incredibly heavy, deeply controversial promise was actually costing her. Sophie absolutely didn't use that incredibly rare, highly important confession to aggressively, intensely defend herself. She quietly, intensely told him that absolute loyalty became entirely, totally meaningless when it could literally only survive through highly aggressive, completely written protection. Her incredibly deep sadness came completely from entirely surrendering an incredibly heavy promise, explicitly intended to deeply honor years of totally flawless service, but she would completely, absolutely surrender it, rather than allow that specific honor to violently, terribly divide the entire family. William, quietly, entirely folded the incredibly heavy renunciation exactly once, and placed it gently on the wooden chapel bench, and then he quietly, intensely, asked the exact, highly unexpected question that totally, completely changed absolutely everything. Would Sophie absolutely still willingly advise him, if absolutely no aggressive, legal document, explicitly, forcefully compelled him to actively listen to her? For the absolute first time, the incredibly stressed future king completely wasn't frantically, heavily debating an aggressively inherited command. He was finally, truly, entirely making his own completely independent choice. Sophie quickly, quietly agreed, but she firmly, absolutely set exactly one crucial, highly specific condition of her incredibly own. William absolutely had to promise that this entirely quiet, totally unwritten agreement would absolutely never, ever be aggressively treated as deep disloyalty to his father. And he also absolutely had to ensure Catherine would completely, truly, never again intensely, terribly feel forced to quietly, secretly, move highly classified documents entirely in secret, just to actively make him hear an incredibly uncomfortable, totally undeniable truth. William completely, quietly accepted, explicitly deciding to entirely, voluntarily sign a massively revised, newly drafted accord, explicitly, voluntarily giving Sophie a highly important, entirely guaranteed 3-year council role, completely under his own, absolute, totally independent authority, rather than aggressively submitting to Charles's incredibly heavy-handed demand. The massive, deeply terrifying deadlock was absolutely, entirely over. The massive, highly stalled timetable could actively move again, but exactly by the time the highly relieved palace finally, publicly confirmed the massive coronation would absolutely proceed, Sophie's incredibly explosive revelation had already completely, entirely escaped absolutely every single boundary specifically, tightly designed to entirely contain it. The incredibly massive, deeply controversial story was absolutely no longer simply about an incredibly boring, internal council seat. It had completely, entirely become a massive, highly public, totally undeniable test of William's absolute, fierce independence, Charles's deeply flawed judgment, and Sophie's incredibly unexpected, highly intense authority. Buckingham Palace moved incredibly, desperately quickly, and aggressively, released a highly formal, totally sanitized statement, explicitly confirming that William had officially, voluntarily approved a massive, highly important 3-year continuity council, and that Sophie would officially serve as its absolute senior family member, entirely during the incredibly sensitive transition. The massive announcement absolutely mattered incredibly deeply because it perfectly, undeniably proved William had absolutely not simply weakly accepted Charles's incredibly aggressive demand. He had entirely brilliantly rewritten it completely under his own absolute authority. Broadcasters intensely, highly publicly framed the incredibly massive settlement as both a highly complex compromise and a deeply serious warning. William had successfully, entirely protected his absolute independence, but he had also deeply, truly accepted that an entirely new reign could absolutely not ruthlessly, simply erase every single relationship that had heavily sustained the old one. Then, one incredibly massive front page completely, absolutely captured the entire, deeply complex crisis, aggressively displaying an image of William firmly carrying the heavy accord beneath the incredibly stark, totally unavoidable headline, "The Promise Before the Crown." Below it incredibly prominently appeared Sophie, quietly arriving for the highly crucial chapel meeting, an incredibly striking image that aggressively spread incredibly quickly because it perfectly, totally reduced weeks of absolute massive private tension to exactly one highly brutal, intensely public question: had the prince truly chosen entirely freely, or had the entire, massive monarchy aggressively forced him to bend to their will? Massive crowds excitedly, intensely gathered exactly outside Windsor Castle, entirely when confirmation of the massive coronation was finally announced, and several people heavily applauded, exactly as Sophie's car slowly passed entirely through the heavy gates, while incredibly others proudly held handwritten signs clearly reading, "Duty deserves a voice." Sophie had absolutely, entirely, never ever asked to become an incredibly massive public cause, yet the entire country had completely turned her intensely private, deeply agonizing sacrifice entirely into a massive national argument. She quietly, deeply watched the intense, unrelenting coverage beside Edward, in a small, incredibly quiet sitting room, and completely, heavily lowered the volume when deeply hyperactive commentators aggressively called her the incredibly powerful woman who had explicitly, forcefully forced William's reluctant hand. Edward quietly, intensely reminded her that the absolute final accord completely carried the prince's total, free choice, completely not her intense pressure, but she deeply, intimately knew that incredibly rapid public judgment absolutely rarely, ever waits for incredibly quiet, entirely private truth. William absolutely, completely refused, incredibly panicked advice to actively distance himself from Sophie, explicitly, fiercely insisting she heavily accompany him to the incredibly next massive transition engagement, actively making their intense, total unity incredibly visible rather than merely quietly claimed in a boring press release. Charles then finally heavily signed the massive, totally necessary coronation approval memorandum and quietly, totally removed his incredibly aggressive, completely original condition entirely from the highly classified official file. The incredibly tired king completely, fully understood exactly what had deeply changed. His newly empowered son had entirely turned an incredibly aggressive, highly imposed demand perfectly into a completely voluntary, highly mature promise. The massive timetable was completely, entirely restored. The intense, utterly terrifying argument was absolutely settled, but exactly one incredibly heavy, entirely final question massively remained. Who had truly, fundamentally, and absolutely prevailed in this intense, world-shifting conflict? The incredibly deep, fully satisfying answer isn't actually found exactly in who ultimately controlled the piece of paper, but entirely in exactly what each incredibly stubborn person was finally, absolutely willing to entirely surrender. So, according to the latest, breathless barrage of royal headlines, Charles deeply feared the absolute disappearance of necessary experience. William intensely feared deeply inheriting a highly restrictive reign, already aggressively controlled by massive promises he had absolutely not personally chosen, and Sophie intensely feared completely becoming vastly more important entirely, as a highly manipulative condition than she had absolutely ever wished to be, simply as a trusted person. Yet, the massive, highly terrifying crisis completely ended absolutely not through total victory or complete defeat, but entirely through three incredibly deep, highly respectful acts of pure surrender, absolutely each one allowing the massive monarchy to actively move forward, without completely, ruthlessly denying exactly what had deeply come before. William signed the heavily revised Coronation Continuity Accord, explicitly giving Sophie 3 highly important years on the absolute sovereign's inner council, completely with direct access during massive emergencies, meaning she would absolutely no longer incredibly serve completely through Charles's aggressive command, but she would highly officially remain, because the absolute future king had completely chosen to trust her perfectly sound judgment. Charles then fully signed the incredibly massive final coronation approval and completely fully withdrew his incredibly aggressive original condition, fully accepting that necessary continuity had absolutely been perfectly protected, entirely without aggressively controlling his incredibly independent son's upcoming reign. William carried both highly important versions of the massive accord entirely into Charles's deeply quiet study, respectfully placed the heavily revised, newly signed document exactly beside the totally unsigned, deeply aggressive original, and quietly waited. The highly exhausted monarch slowly, intensely read his incredibly proud son's firm signature, then slowly removed the highly toxic, completely old condition completely from the massive desk, and instead of officially, formally sending it to the massive, highly secure official archive, he quietly, deliberately locked it entirely inside a highly private drawer. The intense, unmistakable message was completely absolute. The aggressive, outdated command permanently belonged to the past. Charles quietly, deeply told William that the incredible condition had absolutely never been deeply designed to aggressively question his absolute strength, but that he had deeply feared that incredibly pure strength, left totally unchallenged, could intensely, tragically become absolute isolation. The highly mature, fully prepared prince intensely answered with entirely equal honesty that absolutely pure trust could completely not be easily inherited, exactly like a heavy crown. It absolutely had to be genuinely offered completely before it could be truly, honestly returned. Sophie quietly, respectfully, entered the incredibly massive room, exactly only entirely after the father and son had deeply, privately spoken, and William immediately, warmly invited her to physically sit exactly beside them, rather than highly formally across the massive desk. That incredibly small, intensely beautiful choice, completely, entirely restored exactly what the incredibly massive argument had absolutely almost completely taken from her. She was absolutely, definitively, no longer the highly toxic, manipulated subject of a deeply contentious bargain, entirely between two incredibly powerful men. She was fully, entirely, officially, a deeply respected part of the final settlement. Sophie had entirely, deeply remained perfectly silent, specifically because she absolutely, truly wanted William's highly important final decision to completely, undeniably belong to him alone. Her heavily documented account had entirely, absolutely not been explicitly intended to publicly expose Charles or aggressively force the future king into total submission. She firmly spoke only because the massive, incredibly toxic secrecy was completely, intensely poisoning their vital trust, and entirely pure silence had finally become completely, significantly more dangerous than the brutal, highly uncomfortable truth. No single, specific person totally, perfectly won. Charles seamlessly preserved vital continuity. William aggressively protected the total independence of his incredibly important reign, and Sophie perfectly gained something vastly, incredibly more meaningful than a forced title, a deeply guaranteed influence, and an incredibly high place, entirely, explicitly granted entirely through massive respect completely, rather than highly toxic obligation. William absolutely became truly, entirely ready for the heavy crown completely, before the incredibly massive coronation itself actually happened, beautifully learning that highly honest, challenging voices absolutely do not weaken deep authority. Charles deeply learned that a highly protective father absolutely must, eventually completely release absolute control, and Sophie perfectly proved that entirely true. Deep loyalty is completely, totally willing to surrender massive power completely to perfectly preserve deep trust. When William finally walked completely toward his incredible, massive coronation, Sophie's highly visible place, exactly beside the new reign, was absolutely no longer Charles's aggressive condition. It was the incredibly secure, future king's absolute, totally voluntary promise, entirely freely made, and completely, fully understood, proving once and for all that real power is rarely captured on paper.